At 6:47 in the morning, First Continental Bank completed its daily reconciliation process. This was a routine that had been performed every business day for decades, a critical checkpoint that ensured the bank's financial position was accurately understood before the start of normal operations. The overnight processing had finished. The automated systems had run their scheduled jobs. Data from hundreds of branches across multiple states had been consolidated into the central reporting systems. Every branch reported normal balances. The numbers from individual locations matched what was expected based on their transaction volumes and historical patterns. Regional supervisors reviewing the morning report saw nothing that required immediate attention or investigation. There were no alarms indicating security breaches, no fraud detection alerts suggesting unauthorized activity, no irregular access attempts that would indicate someone was trying to compromise the bank's systems. Everything appeared to be functioning exactly as it should. The morning operations team began their workday with the confidence that comes from seeing clean reports and green status indicators across all monitoring dashboards. Managers logged into their systems. Department heads prepared for their daily briefings. The bank was ready to serve customers, process transactions, and conduct the business of banking exactly as it did every other day. Then a regional controller, someone whose job involved comparing financial data across different time periods and different reporting systems, noticed something that did not make sense. She was preparing a quarterly analysis that required pulling data from multiple sources and reconciling them against each other. This was the kind of deep analytical work that went beyond the daily operational reports, looking at longer-term trends and patterns. As she compared the numbers, something impossible became apparent. The bank's overall financial position did not match what it should be based on the sum of all its activities. Money was missing. Not a small discrepancy that could be explained by timing differences or accounting adjustments. Not an error that would be caught and corrected through normal reconciliation processes. $88 million had simply vanished from the bank's accounts. This was not money stolen in a single large withdrawal that would have immediately triggered every alarm the bank possessed. It was not money taken from a vault in a dramatic robbery that would have made headlines. It was not money moved overseas in one massive transaction that would have been flagged by anti-money laundering systems and compliance monitoring. The loss had occurred quietly, gradually, over an extended period of time, and it had been accomplished by someone who did not currently work at the bank, someone who had not had official access to bank systems for years. The person responsible was a retired bank clerk named Richard Coleman. He was 63 years old when the theft was discovered, though the actual taking of the money had occurred over a period that stretched back considerably further. For 31 years, Richard had worked at First Continental Bank in various operational roles, starting as a junior clerk in the records department and eventually becoming a senior operations clerk with responsibilities that touched nearly every aspect of the bank's back office functions. He had been part of the institution for so long that he had lived through multiple complete eras of banking technology and practice. He had started his career in the early 1980s when banks still used paper ledgers for many transactions, when record-keeping involved physical documents filed in vast rooms, when carbon copies created duplicate records, when reconciliation meant physically comparing numbers written on different pieces of paper. Young people who joined the bank in recent years could hardly imagine this world, but Richard had lived and worked in it for years before the digital transformation began. Richard had helped transition the bank from those paper-based systems to the digital infrastructure that now handled billions of dollars in daily transactions without human intervention. He had not been a senior executive or a technology architect. He had been something perhaps more valuable, someone who understood both the old ways and the new ways, someone who could translate between the paper-based procedures that veteran employees understood and the digital workflows that young programmers were trying to implement. He had been part of the teams that implemented new software platforms in the late 1980s and early 1990s. While programmers wrote code, Richard had helped design workflows that would replicate old procedures in the new systems. He had tested the migration of data from legacy systems to modern databases, catching errors that technical staff would have missed because they did not understand what the data actually represented or how it would be used in practice. He had documented business processes, writing the procedure manuals that explained how things should be done and why. He had helped establish the business rules that governed automated decision-making, specifying what kinds of transactions required human approval and what kinds could be processed automatically. He had trained dozens, probably hundreds, of younger employees over the years, teaching them not just how to use the systems, but why the procedures existed and what problems they were designed to solve. Richard had been good at his job in the way that employees who form the backbone of large institutions are good at their jobs. He was reliable, showing up every day and completing his assigned tasks without drama or complaint. He was knowledgeable, accumulating expertise through years of exposure to different aspects of banking operations. He was careful, understanding that errors in financial operations could have serious consequences and that attention to detail was not optional. He was helpful to colleagues, willing to answer questions and explain procedures and share his understanding with others who needed to learn. The kind of employee that institutions depend on but rarely celebrate. His name did not appear in annual reports. He was never featured in company newsletters or promotional materials. He did not receive awards or bonuses beyond the modest cost of living increases that came with each year of service. He was simply there, day after day, year after year, doing the work that needed to be done so that the bank could function smoothly. He understood the details of banking operations in ways that most people, including many senior executives, never needed to understand. He knew how different systems communicated with each other, what data formats they used, what timing assumptions they made about when information would be available. He knew where data was stored and how it flowed through various processes, from initial entry through multiple transformations to final reporting. He knew the business rules that governed approvals, the logic that determined what required additional review, and what could proceed automatically. He knew the exception handling procedures that dealt with unusual situations, the workarounds that had been developed when standard processes did not fit particular circumstances. And then, during a corporate restructuring in the late 2010s that the bank euphemistically called a modernization initiative, Richard had been forced into early retirement. This was part of a broader trend in banking where institutions were cutting costs by eliminating positions held by older employees with higher salaries and replacing them with younger workers who could be paid less for the same work. The bank was also automating functions that had previously required human judgment, replacing experienced clerks with software that could process transactions faster and more cheaply. Richard was told his position was being eliminated as part of the efficiency improvements. He was offered a retirement package that was presented as generous, but was actually calculated to minimize the bank's costs while providing just enough to avoid potential age discrimination lawsuits. The package included a pension based on his years of service, but the formula used to calculate it meant that his monthly payments would barely cover his basic living expenses. There were health care benefits, but they were less comprehensive than what he had received as an active employee, with higher deductibles and more restrictions on coverage. The financial security that Richard had worked 3 decades to achieve turned out to be far more precarious than it should have been. He had believed, based on communications from the bank over the years, that his pension would allow him to retire comfortably. But when the actual numbers were calculated, when he sat down with the retirement counselor and worked through the spreadsheets, he realized that comfort was not going to be part of his retirement. He would be able to survive, but just barely. Any unexpected expense, any medical problem, any increase in his living costs would push him toward financial crisis. Richard did not make a scene when he was let go. He did not argue or complain or threaten legal action. He cleaned out his desk. He attended his modest retirement gathering where colleagues said polite things about his years of service. He turned in his security badge and his building access card. He set up his pension payments and his retirement account distributions. He left the bank's offices for the last time and went home to begin what was supposed to be the next chapter of his life. But unlike most retired employees, Richard never stopped thinking about the bank's systems. Not because he was bitter, though the circumstances of his departure had certainly been disappointing. Not because he was planning revenge, at least not initially, but simply because after spending more than 3 decades immersed in the operational details of how a major financial institution functioned, he could not just turn off that knowledge and awareness. He found himself thinking about the systems he had helped build, remembering the decisions that had been made during implementations, recognizing patterns in how the bank operated. understanding, perhaps better than anyone currently employed there, how all the pieces fit together beneath the surface. The bank prided itself on having sophisticated security measures. It had invested heavily in technology and processes designed to protect customer funds and prevent fraud. It had layered approval requirements that ensured multiple people reviewed significant transactions. It had automated fraud detection systems that analyzed patterns and flagged suspicious activity. It had compliance monitoring that checked for violations of banking regulations. It had internal audit teams that regularly reviewed operations looking for weaknesses or irregularities. The bank's management was confident in these controls. They believed they had created a secure environment where theft or fraud would be quickly detected and stopped. They had hired security consultants who had reviewed their systems and made recommendations. They had implemented industry best practices. They had trained employees on security awareness and proper procedures. But the bank's security model relied on one dangerous assumption that no one had seriously questioned. It assumed that retired employees, once they left the organization, would simply stop being relevant to the bank's security posture. They would no longer have access to systems. They would no longer know current passwords or procedures. They would gradually forget the operational details they had once known. They would move on with their lives and stop thinking about the bank entirely. This assumption seemed reasonable on the surface. After all, access controls were in place. Retired employees' credentials were deactivated. Their system logins were disabled. Their security badges stopped working. From a technical perspective, they could no longer access the bank's infrastructure. But what the bank failed to consider was that someone like Richard, who had spent 3 decades deeply embedded in the operational details of banking systems, possessed something that could not be revoked by disabling an account or deactivating a badge. He possessed institutional knowledge. He understood how the bank actually worked, not just how it was supposed to work according to policy documents and procedure manuals. During his long career spanning more than 3 decades, Richard had noticed something that few people cared about or paid serious attention to, something that became increasingly significant as he thought about it during his retirement. When the bank modernized its systems, replacing old technology with new platforms and updating procedures to reflect current best practices and regulatory requirements, it did not actually eliminate the old rules and logic that had governed operations for decades. Instead, those legacy procedures were often quietly embedded into the new systems, maintained for backward compatibility, or simply because no one fully understood whether they were still needed or what would break if they were removed. The bank had undergone multiple waves of technological change during Richard's career. In the 1980s, it had computerized basic record-keeping, replacing handwritten ledgers with database systems. In the 1990s, it had implemented client-server architectures that allowed branches to access centralized data. In the 2000s, it had moved to web-based platforms and begun integrating online banking. In the 2010s, it had adopted cloud services and mobile applications. Each transition had been presented as a complete modernization, a fresh start with new technology. But in reality, each transition had involved compromises and concessions made to ensure the change did not disrupt operations or require retraining thousands of employees on completely new procedures. Old procedures were translated into new system logic rather than being reconsidered from first principles. Historical permissions were carried forward because it was easier than figuring out what access rights people actually needed. Exception handling rules that had been created decades ago to address specific situations were maintained, even when those situations no longer occurred, or when the reasons for the special handling had been forgotten. The result was that certain internal processes still depended on outdated reconciliation logic that had been designed for an era when data moved slowly between systems and needed to be manually compared. They relied on trust-based overrides that assumed human operators would exercise good judgment rather than strictly enforcing rules. Overrides that had made sense when experienced clerks were making decisions, but that created vulnerabilities when those decisions became automated. They used historical permission structures that granted broader access than anyone realized because they had been created before the bank had implemented modern role-based access controls with their principle of least privilege. They made assumptions about what constituted low-risk activity based on patterns that had been true decades ago, but that might not be true anymore. For instance, certain types of internal transfers between accounts had been considered routine in an era when such transfers were rare and always had legitimate business purposes. The system still treated these transfers as low risk, not flagging them for additional review, even though the context that made them low risk had changed. These rules and procedures were invisible to new staff members who had been hired in the past 5 or 10 years. Young employees who had joined the bank after the most recent modernization efforts had learned to use the current systems and interfaces. They knew how to process transactions according to current procedures. They could navigate the software, complete the required fields, follow the documented workflows, but they did not understand the historical context behind what they were doing. They did not know why certain fields existed in databases even though no one ever filled them out anymore. They did not know why certain approval workflows followed seemingly illogical patterns, requiring reviews from specific departments that had no obvious reason to be involved. They did not recognize that some of the system behaviors they took for granted, things that just seemed like quirks or oddities of how the software worked, were actually artifacts of decisions made long ago. Decisions made by people like Richard, people who were trying to solve specific problems in specific contexts that no longer existed. But Richard knew. He had been present when many of these rules were created. He had sat in the meetings where technical compromises were negotiated between what the business wanted and what the technology could deliver. He had helped write the specifications that developers used to implement the new systems, translating business requirements into technical language. He had tested the migration of old logic into new platforms, verifying that the new systems could handle all the edge cases and exceptions that the old systems had dealt with. He had documented the reasoning behind various decisions, though much of that documentation had been lost or forgotten over the years as people retired and files were archived. He understood not just what the systems did, but why they did it and what assumptions were built into their design. He knew which rules were actually important and which ones were legacy artifacts that no one had bothered to remove. He knew where the gaps were between what the systems checked for and what they assumed would be checked by humans. He knew what would happen if you created certain combinations of conditions that the systems had not been designed to handle because those combinations were not supposed to occur in normal operations. Over the months following his retirement, as Richard adjusted to his new life and worried about his financial situation and thought about the 31 years he had spent helping build the bank's operational infrastructure, he began to realize something. The bank no longer verified reality. It verified expectation. The automated systems that now handled most operational decisions were not actually checking whether transactions made sense in any meaningful way. They were checking whether transactions fit expected patterns. If a transaction matched certain criteria regarding its size, its timing, its origin point, and its classification in the bank's taxonomy of transaction types, it would be approved automatically without human scrutiny. This made sense from an efficiency perspective. The bank processed millions of transactions every day. It was not feasible to have humans review each one. The automated systems needed to make decisions quickly based on program rules. Those rules had been designed to catch obvious problems while allowing normal business to proceed smoothly. But Richard understood something that the current employees probably did not fully grasp. He understood how to make activity look expected. He knew what patterns the systems were looking for. He knew what thresholds would trigger additional review. He knew what types of transactions were considered routine and what types were considered unusual. He knew this because he had helped establish these patterns and thresholds years ago when the systems were being designed. The plan that eventually formed in Richard's mind during the months and years following his retirement was not something he rushed into impulsively. He was methodical by nature, a quality that had been reinforced by decades of banking work where carelessness could have serious consequences. He was trained to be careful and thorough, to think through implications before acting, to consider what could go wrong and how to prevent it. These habits did not disappear just because he was no longer employed by the bank. He spent months, perhaps even longer, thinking through what would be theoretically possible given his knowledge of the bank's systems and operations, not just vaguely possible in some abstract sense, but practically achievable given the real-world constraints he would be operating under. He would not have physical access to the bank's buildings. He would not have active credentials that would let him log into systems. He could not walk into a branch and conduct transactions under his own identity without creating an obvious trail. He could not recruit accomplices from among current employees because that would create risks he could not control and would violate the fundamental principle of operational security. He would not need to hack into systems in any traditional sense, because hacking would leave traces that security monitors would detect. Modern intrusion detection systems were sophisticated. They logged all network traffic. They analyzed patterns looking for anomalies. They alerted security teams when unusual access attempts occurred. If Richard tried to break into the bank's systems from outside, he would almost certainly be caught. And even if he succeeded initially, the evidence of the intrusion would eventually be found. He would not need to forge documents or create fake authorizations, because forgery would create physical or digital artifacts that investigators could examine. Documents could be subjected to forensic analysis. Digital files contained metadata that revealed when they were created and modified. Any forgery would be discoverable given enough time and expert examination. He would not need to steal credentials from current employees, guessing their passwords or tricking them into revealing their login information, because stolen credentials would eventually be detected. Banks monitored for unusual account activity. If an account suddenly started being used in ways that did not match the normal patterns for that user, it would trigger alerts. The legitimate owner of the credentials would likely notice unauthorized activity and report it. He would not need to bribe employees or recruit accomplices to help him from inside the bank, because involving other people would create risks that would be impossible to manage. Each additional person would be a potential point of failure. They might change their minds. They might make mistakes. They might talk to someone they should not talk to. They might be caught and might cooperate with investigators to reduce their own punishment. The more people involved in a criminal enterprise, the more likely it was to fail. Instead, Richard's approach would be built around exploiting his deep understanding of how the bank's systems actually worked beneath their modern interface, beneath the graphical user interfaces and the mobile apps and the polished customer experience. He would use the legacy procedures that were still embedded in the operational logic, the old rules that still govern certain types of transactions, even though most current employees did not know they existed. He would trigger the automated processes in ways that would make the bank's own systems authorize the movement of money according to their program logic. He would stay within documented procedures, ensuring that every action appeared routine according to the rules as written, even though the cumulative effect of many such actions would be anything but routine. Richard understood that he needed to avoid triggering review thresholds that would bring human attention to his activities. The bank's monitoring systems were designed to flag unusual activity for investigation. If a single transaction was too large, it would automatically require additional approval from senior staff. If transactions originated from an unexpected source or followed unusual routing, they would be investigated. If patterns deviated too far from historical norms, if activity looked statistically improbable based on what the systems had learned to expect, they would generate alerts that would land on someone's desk. But Richard knew exactly what the thresholds were because he had helped establish many of them years ago. He knew what the systems considered normal because he had participated in the analysis that defined normality. He knew how to structure activity so that each individual transaction would appear unremarkable, properly categorized, correctly documented, fully compliant with procedures, even though the aggregate effect across many transactions over an extended period would be substantial. He knew how to ensure that every action appeared routine. He understood what fields needed to be filled out and what ways to make transactions seem like ordinary operational activity. He knew what transaction codes to use, what classification categories to select, what timing patterns to follow. He knew how to make the activity blend into the enormous volume of legitimate transactions that the bank processed every day, becoming invisible through being ordinary rather than through being hidden. He also understood that he needed to rely on the bank's confidence in its own controls to weaponize the institution's trust in its technology. The bank believed its systems were secure. Management had invested millions of dollars in security infrastructure. They had hired consultants who assured them their controls were industry-leading. They trusted that their automated monitoring would catch problems, that if something was seriously wrong, alarms would sound and alerts would be generated. Richard would use that confidence against the institution. He would make the bank's own trust in its technology into a vulnerability. If the systems did not generate alerts, the bank would assume everything was fine. If transactions passed all the automated checks, no one would look closer. The very sophistication of the security infrastructure would work in his favor because it would create a false sense of security, a belief that if the expensive monitoring systems were not detecting problems, then there must not be any problems to detect. The execution of Richard's plan occurred gradually over an extended period that stretched across months and possibly years. This was not a single dramatic event that would be memorable to people who experienced it. It was a sustained operation that required patience and discipline, that required Richard to proceed carefully even when he might have been tempted to accelerate, that required him to maintain operational security over a long time frame without making mistakes that would expose his activities. Money moved through legitimate channels within the bank's infrastructure, using the actual systems and processes that the bank relied on for its daily operations. Transfers were initiated that appeared to follow proper procedures according to the documentation. Transactions were classified in ways that made them seem like routine operational activity to the automated monitoring systems that analyzed patterns and flagged anomalies. Each transaction, examined individually, would appear to have legitimate business purposes and proper authorization. Approvals were granted automatically by the bank's systems because the transactions met all the technical criteria that the automated approval processes checked for. The business rules that govern these processes, rules that had been programmed based on specifications written years ago, found nothing concerning about the activity. The size of individual transactions stayed below the thresholds that would require human review. The timing fit normal patterns, occurring during regular business hours at intervals that did not suggest unusual urgency. The transaction codes indicated routine operational activity, the kind of internal bookkeeping and account management that banks perform constantly. Everything appeared to be in order according to the logic programmed into the systems, logic that Richard understood intimately because he had helped create it. Audits reconciled without question because the transactions were properly recorded in all the relevant systems. The data was consistent across different platforms. The documentation existed to support the activity. When the automated reconciliation processes ran, comparing balances and looking for discrepancies, they found everything balanced according to their program rules. Oversight systems assumed they were seeing normal variance, the kind of minor fluctuations that occur in any large institution, processing millions of transactions. The bank's operations staff, trusting their monitoring systems and seeing no alerts, believed that everything was functioning perfectly. They had no reason to look deeper or question whether the automated systems might be missing something. In reality, the bank was being drained intentionally by someone who understood its operational logic better than the people currently running it. Richard was exploiting the gap between what the systems were designed to detect and what was actually happening. He was using knowledge that the bank did not realize he possessed to accomplish something the bank did not think was possible. By the time discrepancies became visible across departments, when the regional controller compared data from different time frames and different reporting systems, $88 million had already moved through the bank's infrastructure and was beyond recovery. The money had not been stolen in a single moment that could be identified and potentially reversed. It had been taken through a series of transactions that had each appeared legitimate at the time they occurred. The theft was not the work of an outside attacker who had penetrated defenses. It was not the result of a violent robbery or a sophisticated hacking operation. It was the work of someone with deep institutional memory, someone who understood how the bank had been built and what assumptions were embedded in its operations. Richard did not flee dramatically when his work was complete. He did not display sudden wealth or make purchases that would attract attention. Instead, he simply stepped away from his old life in a manner that appeared entirely normal for a retiree. He closed long-standing accounts at various financial institutions, something that retirees often do when consolidating their finances. He sold his home, which was not unusual for someone entering retirement who might want to downsize or relocate. He left the city quietly, moving away without fanfare or dramatic announcements. He disappeared into retirement once more, this time with resources that would ensure his financial security for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed the discovery of the missing $88 million was extensive and involved multiple agencies. The bank's internal security team worked alongside external auditors, federal regulators, and law enforcement specialists in financial crimes. They examined years of transaction data. They reviewed system logs. They interviewed current and former employees. They tried to understand how such a massive theft could have occurred without triggering any of the bank's sophisticated monitoring systems. What they found was deeply troubling from a security perspective. There was no evidence of hacking or unauthorized system intrusion. No one had broken into the bank's networks from outside. No malware had been planted. No security vulnerabilities in the traditional technical sense had been exploited. There was no evidence of forced access to systems or data. Every transaction had been processed through proper channels using legitimate system functions. No one had bypassed authentication or defeated access controls. There were no rule violations that auditors could identify. Every transaction, when examined individually, had followed documented procedures. The approvals had come from authorized system components. The documentation supported the activity. According to the bank's own policies and procedures, everything had been done correctly. There were no suspicious logins that would indicate someone had stolen credentials and was impersonating an authorized user. The system access logs showed only routine activity from legitimate accounts. The investigators eventually focused on Richard Coleman as a suspect, but building a case against him proved extremely difficult. They could establish that he had the knowledge to understand the bank's systems deeply. They could show that he had financial motivations given his modest pension. They could demonstrate that the theft had used techniques that required insider knowledge of the bank's operations, but they could not prove that he had actually broken any laws. The transactions had followed documented procedures. The bank's own systems had authorized the movement of money. If the automated systems had granted approval, could that be considered theft? Or had the bank, through its own systems, voluntarily transferred the money? This legal ambiguity, combined with the difficulty of tracing exactly where the money had gone through the complex web of transactions that Richard had created, meant that prosecutors were reluctant to bring charges. They were not confident they could prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. They were concerned that a trial might expose weaknesses in the banking system that would undermine public confidence. Richard Coleman was never formally charged with any crime. His name was never publicly released in connection with the theft. Law enforcement agencies maintained files on him and continued to search for him, but he was never located. He had vanished as completely as the $88 million he had taken. The bank faced a crisis that extended beyond the immediate financial loss. Regulators demanded explanations for how such a massive theft could occur in an institution that was supposed to have robust controls. Customers worried about whether their money was safe. Investors questioned whether the bank's management was competent. Insurance companies investigated whether they would be liable for covering the loss. In response, the bank undertook a comprehensive review of its internal rules and procedures. Legacy permissions that had been carried forward from older systems were finally stripped out. Automated approval processes were redesigned with more stringent checks. Former employee access, which had never been systematically audited, was reviewed for the first time in decades. The bank discovered numerous other potential vulnerabilities that existed because institutional knowledge about why certain rules existed had been lost over time. These changes, while necessary, came too late to prevent the theft or recover the money. They represented an expensive education in the dangers of accumulated technical debt and the importance of understanding not just how systems work currently, but how they were designed and what assumptions were built into them. Other financial institutions, learning about the incident through industry channels, conducted their own reviews. Banking regulators issued guidance about the risks associated with legacy system logic and the need to periodically audit all automated approval processes. The incident became a case study in financial security circles, discussed in conferences and training programs as an example of how insider knowledge could be weaponized. But Richard Coleman remained at large, never found despite extensive efforts to locate him. Some investigators believed he had created a new identity years before the theft, building documentation and history that would allow him to disappear cleanly when the time came. Others thought he might have left the country, perhaps to a jurisdiction that would not cooperate with American law enforcement. A few wondered if he had died, if the stress or some unrelated health issue had claimed him before he could enjoy the fruits of his crime. What seemed certain was that Richard had planned his exit as carefully as he had planned the theft itself. He had understood that taking the money was only half the challenge. The other half was disappearing successfully, becoming unfindable in a world where digital traces and surveillance made it increasingly difficult for people to vanish. The most troubling aspect of the case, from the perspective of banking security professionals, was that the theft had been accomplished entirely through understanding, rather than through any technical exploit or physical force. Richard had not needed to break into anything or defeat any security measures in the traditional sense. He had simply needed to remember how the bank's systems had been designed, what assumptions had been made, and where the gaps existed between theory and practice. He had spent 31 years helping to build the bank's operational infrastructure. He had been trusted with that knowledge because he was an employee, because he needed to know these things to do his job effectively. The bank had never considered that this knowledge itself could become a weapon if someone with the right combination of motivation and expertise decided to use it. The theft proved that the most dangerous threat to a financial institution might not be a sophisticated hacker or an organized criminal enterprise. It might be someone who had spent decades working inside the institution, someone who had helped build the very systems that were supposed to provide security, someone who understood those systems well enough to exploit them without ever appearing to break the rules. First Continental Bank eventually recovered from the incident in the sense that it continued operating and rebuilt its reputation over time. But it never recovered the $88 million, and it never found Richard Coleman. The case remained officially open, files maintained by various agencies, his name on watch lists and in databases. But as years passed without any trace of him, investigators had to acknowledge that he had succeeded in accomplishing what he had set out to do. He had taken a massive sum of money from an institution that prided itself on security. He had done it using nothing but institutional memory and understanding. He had robbed a bank without ever entering it, without ever touching a weapon, without ever threatening anyone or breaking through any physical barriers. He had simply remembered how things were designed and used that memory to make the bank's own systems work against it. The story of Richard Coleman became a cautionary tale within the financial industry. It illustrated that security was not just about technology and procedures. It was about understanding who possessed deep knowledge of how systems worked and ensuring that knowledge could not be weaponized. It was about recognizing that institutional memory, the accumulated understanding of how an organization really functions beneath its official processes, could be both an asset and a liability. Banks and other financial institutions began to think differently about employees who had been with them for decades. They started to consider what would happen if those employees, with all their knowledge and experience, were to become adversaries. They realized that the most valuable knowledge was not always documented in procedure manuals and could not always be protected by access controls. And somewhere, Richard Coleman presumably lived out his retirement with the security he had been denied by his modest pension. He had taken what he believed he was owed, or perhaps what he felt he deserved, after giving 3 decades of his life to an institution that had discarded him when he became expensive. The $88 million represented, in his mind perhaps, compensation for knowledge that had been invaluable to the bank, but had never been properly rewarded. The money had been taken by someone who remembered how things were designed, by someone who understood the system too well, by someone whose institutional memory had become the most effective weapon a bank robber could possess.